Chapter 8, Section 3. Railroads open the West to rapid settlements. An Easterner bound for California gold fields in 1849 could not have made it halfway to the Mississippi River by train alone. Before the 1850s, most railroads were short lines connecting cities and towns in just one region. A flurry of rail building in the 1850s changed that. By 1860, rail lines extended from the Atlantic coast across the Mississippi. This expansion set the stage for opening up western lands to settlement and linking the east and west coasts by rail. The gold rush had produced a population explosion in the far west, yet this growing region remained in isolation, essentially separated from the rest of the nation. During the 1850s, many people pointed out the need for better transportation and communication between east and west. In particular, merchants demanded a faster way to transport goods across the Great Plains and the Rockies. They wanted a transcontinental railroad, one that spanned the continent. This need presented a great opportunity to railroad builders. The first transcontinental railroad creates huge challenges. In 1861, 4 wealthy merchants in Sacramento, California, founded the Central Pacific Railroad Company. Known as the Big Four, they sought government support for a transcontinental railroad. One of them, C.P. Huntington, went to Washington to act as a lobbyist to push for a railroad bill. Lobbyists tried to persuade legislators to pass laws favorable to groups they represent. Plans for a transcontinental railroad had been stalled by debate in Congress over whether to follow a northern or southern route. However, the South's secession and the onset of the Civil War led Congress to support a northern route that would unite California and Oregon with the rest of the Union. The Pacific Railway Act, passed in 1862, directed the Central Pacific and the newly created Union Pacific Railroad Company to construct railway and telegraph lines from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. The Union Pacific would start in Omaha, Nebraska, and work its way west. The Central Pacific would start in Sacramento and head east. Building the first transcontinental railroad posed tremendous challenges. One problem was raising enough funds. Under the Pacific Railway Act, the government pledged to help each company by granting it 6,400 acres of land and up to $48,000 in loans for each mile of track laid. Once a lane of rails began, the owners could sell the land to settlers to help pay for construction costs. But they needed startup money. The Union Pacific had trouble raising funds and did not lay its first rails until 1865. The Union Pacific also faced conflict with some of the tribes that lived on the Great Plains. Its route followed the Platte River through the territory controlled by the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Sioux. All 3 tribes had been battling the U.S. Army for years, and their attacks on railroad workers sometimes stopped construction. For the Central Pacific, rough terrain was a major challenge. Crossing the Sierra Nevada was an epic engineering feat. The rail line had to pass over and sometimes through high mountain passes. It also had to bridge deep canyons. On some days, progress was measured in inches. Beyond the Sierra Nevada lay the Great Basin, a vast dry region where summers are blistering hot. Workers on the railroad, jobs and hardship for immigrants. In meeting these construction challenges, the 2 railroad companies owed much of their success to immigrant labor. At first, both companies faced a severe labor shortage. They needed thousands of workers, but the Civil War and the gold rush had siphoned off a large part of the labor pool. The end of the Civil War in 1865 solved part of the Union Pacific's labor problem. Ex-soldiers and former slaves eagerly joined company crews. So did immigrants from Europe. In fact, the bulk of its 12,000-man workforce was made up of Irish immigrants. Large numbers of Irish began immigrating to the United States after a potato disease brought famine to Ireland in 1845. Many first settled in eastern cities, where they were looked down on for being Catholic and poor. In the face of such discrimination, railroad jobs seemed like an attractive opportunity. When the Central Pacific began construction in 1865, it also faced a shortage of workers. In desperation, it decided to hire workers from China, despite widespread prejudice against the Chinese. The company advertised in China, promising impoverished workers good pay. By 1868, the Central Pacific was employing about 10,000 Chinese workers, who made up 4/5 of its labor force. Chinese workers were paid lower wages than white workers and were targets of racism. Working on the railroad was both strenuous and dangerous. Some workers were killed in Indian attacks. The use of dynamite to blast tunnels through the Sierra Nevada also resulted in injuries and deaths. Extreme cold and winter left many workers with frostbite. and snow avalanches killed others. Yet the workers who survived had money in their pockets. railroads become lifelines in the West. Both companies overcame all obstacles, and on May 10, 1869, their lines met at Promontory Point, Utah. That day marked a turning point in the history of the West. With the completion of the railroad, travel time between the Pacific and Atlantic coast shrank from 4 months to 10 days. To mark the occasion, 2 officials, one from each company, drove ceremonial spikes of gold and silver into the railroad ties. Once the first Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, railroad construction continued elsewhere with a fury. This rapid expansion made many railroad barons, like the Big Four, very rich. It also encouraged settlement by making land available to farm families. Towns sprang up along the routes. In addition, railroads served the transportation needs of new industries, such as mining and lumbering. Perhaps most importantly, they united East and West. For many people in the West, the railroads became lifelines, but because farmers depended on them, the railroads could charge excessive rates to ship their crops to market. Such policies led to growing demand for some government control over the railroad companies.